And you also don't know what that's going to do in the soil, because even for people that are doing it, as was just witnessed, sometimes we don't know. But when you have diversity, you're actually de-risking what it is that you're growing. Thanks for having me here. I'm just working through a cold that my great 2 grandsons gave me, so if I have to take a break, that's because of those 2 little guys. I thought I'd introduce myself just a little bit. I'm not as famous as Steve or Joe, so just so you know a bit where I'm coming from. I've had a bit of a non-linear career path, I call it. So I spent 10 years at a little-known Canadian company called Nortel Networks. And so I did that for 10 years, and then I made a bit of a career change in 1998, and I went to manage a large cattle ranch that some friends of ours had purchased out west of Sundre. And so it is a 50,000 acre cow-calf operation. There was about 60 head of cows when I got there, and we grew it up to 550 mother cows, which was overstocked. And so we found out that a good stocking rate was about 350 head. It was some tough going out there. I was just visiting with Barry, who our kids grew up together out there. It's sometimes only 30 consecutive frost-free days out there, and typically 100 maybe at best. An inch and a half of gray wooded soil where you can find soil. Grizzly bears, cougars, wolves, you name it. So it taught me lots of times by as much as failure as success, what worked and what didn't work out there. And then I left from the Red Deer River Ranch just about 7 years ago, and I went to take a one semester, one course teaching job at Olds College, because I'd always liked being around kids, and I always thought I should have been a teacher. My whole family are teachers, so I went to do that, and I will tell you the honest truth. Like, I have been right in front of grizzly bears, cougars around me, walked home in the middle of the night, like you name it, and I was never as scared as standing at the front of a class of 25 kids that were all from farms and ranches, and I was supposed to be the sage on the stage. And so that taught me a lot about humility and the work it takes to actually be an educator. And then I left there a couple of years ago, and I went to work for an ag tech startup company. And this company was using some very leading edge technology, a neutron generator and gamma ray detectors to measure soil carbon. But the reason why I went there is because I saw the value in this technology to help people advance their regenerative ag practices. And I left there a year ago, and I had a lot of people reaching out to me very shortly after that change, and they said, well, hey, you talk a lot about regenerative ag, and we know that you did some of that. Would you help us with our regenerative agriculture plans, or can you do some consulting? And I thought, hey, well, maybe that's what this new chapter of my life should be. So that's what I do now, is I work as a regenerative agriculture consultant. I predominantly work with the folks at Understanding Ag, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on the really amazing thing that Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams and some other partners have built up over the last few years. Understanding Ag, it's 25 different consultants that hail out of the U.S., out of Mexico, Canada, and the U.K., and we work together as an organization to provide farmers and ranchers and organizations with regenerative agriculture consulting. And so I'm going to talk about what that looks like from that perspective, and then we're going to also talk about specifically about soil armor and disturbance. But I do have a question. My question is, what are the 3 questions that you're trying to answer in your business? And there's no right or wrong answer, but I'll be like Joe, like I'm not moving on until you give me an answer. So give me just one thing that you think you're trying to solve in your business. Sustainability? Okay. What's that? Quality of life? Yeah. That's another one?
She asked, when do I quit?
So, and the back? Profit, yeah. Any others? I think those are all right answers. My 3 answers are profitability, increasing functional soil health, and enhancing the nutrient density of food. When I look at farms and ranches, I think those are the three things that we're all trying to solve, and it's about profitability first. And sustainability is important, and all these other things are important, but if we're running businesses, right? And so what we're here today is to talk about soil health. That's what healthy soil looks like, and we've seen a few different pictures of that already today. I've heard it, it should look like chocolate cake or black cottage cheese, or that's a handful of just about the healthiest soil that I can think of that is got good soil aggregation. It's got lots of glomalin in it. It's full of microbial life. It's got lots of other life growing. Like, that's what we want to get to. And so at Understanding Ag, you'll hear this a lot, even from some of the literature, and it is about trying to achieve common ground for common good. But that has to be achieved with those sort of three other things in place as well, right? And so this is the mission of the organization, is to use our passion and experience to educate farmers, ranchers, and communities in applying time-tested ecological principles to regenerate our living ecosystems and thereby restoring the health of all. So what we're all trying to understand about regenerative agriculture is this is awakening ancient knowledge to a certain degree. Like, a lot of this isn't brand new. I think it's remembering some of the things that work so well from a biological or nature-based system perspective. I hear often, well, what's the definition for regenerative agriculture? Or there should be no definition, and like it should be kind of wide open. And I'm now, in the last even few months, seeing large corporations trying to redefine regenerative agriculture. So, like, for example, Bayer has a giant web presence now for regenerative agriculture. So I think the best definition for regenerative agriculture is this one. And this is the one that this group sticks by, this Understanding Ag, and it's the one that I stick by. So it's farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life in the soil and expanding to all life above the soil. So that's the one that I'm going to stick to because it makes the most sense to me. And I'm sure happy to, if you've got your own definition or reasons why you think that does or doesn't work, I'd be happy to chat with you after. So I think, Steve, you talked about changing mindset, right? And I know that I can help somebody in their regenerative journey if I can tell that they've changed their head and their heart first. So they've changed their mindset. But it's almost impossible for me to convince somebody to do that. But once they've realized somewhere kind of if within themselves that they've changed their head and their heart, then I can help them change their practices. And when consumers want more of this, right? They say they're more interested in environment and sustainability and climate change or climate whatever. They want all these things, but they're not, probably almost none of them are even aware what it would mean to have a regenerative food system. And so that's what we want to do and help them to have a positive mind, positive body, and positive environment. But then we have to change our thinking, and we have to change our paradigms and our practices so that we can actually achieve common ground. And getting to common ground is a super hard thing to do. I don't know if you've all noticed, I'm pretty sure you have, that politics in Canada and the US and other places, and just life in general, is so polarizing. And my wife catches me more than I catch myself, or I think I try and stay in common ground. Like, I think I try and do that. But as soon as I start saying things are polarizing, then I'm obviously kind of making an us and them situation. And so I'm trying to work around that. And so I just finished grad school a little while ago. Took me a long time. My grandson thinks it's hilarious that I was 56 when I finally graduated. But I built this model when I was at grad school because I was like, okay, well, what is common ground? And so there's those 3 things that I think that are, so profitability, functional soil health, and nutrient density. But we all come at agriculture from a different place, right? And I think that there's sort of this isn't completely definitive, but I think it works pretty good. So there's conventional, organic, sustainable, and regenerative. In conventional, we've done a great job in the Green Revolution, or Agriculture 4.0. Like, in terms of yield, we've done an amazing thing. But in terms of what we've done to the soil by mining the value out of the soil I actually think it's a huge problem. It's probably a way bigger problem than any of the rest of the world that talks about climate change. Like, I think we should be way more worried about soil health. Organic farming, for sure, there's an avoidance of chemical inputs, but it relies highly on tillage. It could increase the nutritional value of food, but if you look at those axes of economic dependence and economic resilience versus depleted soil health and improved soil health, I think organic maybe doesn't achieve what it could. Sustainable, I hear that word all the time, and no offense to you that brought up that word, but it's actually one of personally, it's my least favorite word, because it's like, what are we sustaining? Like, we're sustaining something that seems to already be degraded, so what's the value of leaving that the same? Sustainable agriculture is dependent on programs. It's often really yield-focused, and it's about maintaining soil health, but I think we need to be regenerative. I think we need to be profit-focused instead of yield-focused. We need to build functional soil health, and we need to increase the nutrient density of food, and by doing all that, we'll strengthen our communities. We'll start to redistribute the way these large global supply chains work, and we'll actually create more of a value web or supply web, and it'll be a lot more like a distributed food system rather than these like enormous global supply chains. So, the 6-3-4 framework, I'm going to talk about that, and I'm hoping what it does is it pulls together everything that we've learned so far today into the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. So understanding ag realized that there was a need to create a framework to help farmers and ranchers build a nature-based or regenerative system around. I think, Joel, you had up sort of the 5 principles before. And even a couple years ago, I became fairly familiar with the 5 principles, but there's a 6th principle, and I think it's the overarching principle, which is context. So most of you know the context of what your growing opportunities, what your growing environment is. And it actually took me a while to think about, what does that mean? What is it, what's my context? And so I think a good example that I use often is, for example, in Alberta, we don't grow cotton very well, or bananas, but we do have a weather system and soil and an ecosystem where we can grow small grains, and we can grow oil seeds and forages and cattle and different livestock species. So, and then within each farm or ranch, you have your own context of what actually is going to be the best crop, the best production approach within that ecosystem. So sometimes it means actually stepping back and saying, well, what is my context? And am I growing within the right context? And then the next 5 principles, we saw those before, which are don't disturb the soil, keep your living root in the soil, keep the soil covered, have diversity, and integrate livestock. And then the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. I talked about context, so I'm going to skip to that. I'm going to get to the 3 rules in a bit, because what I want to do now is actually sort of break down each one of these 6 principles, or the next 5. And this one is about not disturbing the soil. So we were talking earlier today about the mycorrhizal fungal network and how important that is to make sure that that isn't disturbed, that it can do the work that it's required to do to deliver to the plants what it needs. But every single time that we till the soil or disturb it with a chemical input, it actually either degrades or it removes almost completely that mycorrhizal fungal network. So think of it as almost like the internet, or think of it as this room filled with all kinds of communication connection cables running through it, like literally running through this room. And then imagine like a 12-foot disc running through this room and cutting those every so many feet. And that's what we're doing every time we till the soil. And we completely disrupt that or destroy it. And so getting to like no-till, we've done a pretty good job over the last couple decades in Western Canada and other parts of North America around no-till. But we need to probably get to the point where we're actually having almost no disturbance to the soil. Broadcast seeding, Steve, that you're doing, like that's a really effective way to have low disturbance. You might not get the sub-inch accuracy of using some kind of variable rate technology and that, but it's very low disturbance. And so I think that probably is one of the things, if you're already doing it, there's maybe more you can do. If you're not doing it, it's maybe one of the places you want to really think about starting. I've been following Gabe ever since I changed over to an adaptive multi-paddock grazing system on the Bar 75. And as an example, when he decided that this was the way that it was going to work for him, he just sold all of his tillage equipment. He just, there was no way for him to go back, because he said, if I keep it, I'm going to use it. And so that was an example of someone that just made that full-on commitment. And so it can be a hard change, but I think that there's new technologies and there's new learning and there's lots of resources and products and services, like what we heard about earlier today, that will help to get towards having a much lower or no disturbance system in terms of mechanical or chemical disturbance. And then armoring the soil. And so this picture shows some residual armor after corn planting. It was at Minoka Farm in Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a research location as well. And so this is just an example of getting some armor on the soil so that you've got something there that is creating a prevention to erosion and to soil degradation, preventing the loss of carbon being respired out of the soil. I've heard lots of my colleagues in the last while, like we have a weekly consultant call, and then I was just away for a week at the annual meeting, and something that I heard twice, and it was just kind of said in passing, and I really picked up on it. And it was Gabe Brown that said it once, and it was one of the other partners that said, if you can do nothing else, like if you're not sure even where to start, at least get your soil covered. Like that, of all the 6 principles, is probably the one that has the most value and impact. If you can do something to reduce that evaporation of water out of the soil, that you can prevent the carbon being respired out of the soil, and you can prevent erosion from happening. And so give that some thought, and if that rings true to you, or if it's maybe offensive to you, it'd be great to talk about that after, to find out, well, what are your thoughts around maybe that being one of the most important things that you can do. So thinking about what that means in terms of the importance of it, it gives that residue for living plants to have a place to live. I was even thinking about, I think, was it Steve, you said there was 300 and something organisms in a cow patty? But 350? But if you remove that, then there's nothing there for them to live in. And it's the same with when you're losing your biological function in your soil, when we take that away, we're removing the place where the biology wants to live. High temperature is a soil killer. So I'm going to walk over here and point. I use this handheld thermographic thermometer to measure soil temperature. And it was really made aware to me. I went to a Soil Health Academy course to see the difference between, we were in Michigan, so what was it that day? It was probably like 30 degrees Celsius. So what's that, 90-something Fahrenheit? So the soil that had grass growing on it and legumes and whatnot that didn't have bare soil, the ground that didn't have any bare soil, was at about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The bare soil, some of that bare soil, like right next to it, was going up to like 110, 120. Milk gets pasteurized at 130. And so we didn't find any that day, but there was lots of the folks I was with that have seen soil that is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's that doing to the biology in the soil? It literally is pasteurizing the soil, right? And we want to keep more biological function in the soil, but it can't live when it gets that hot. So covering your soil, that's why this is so important. While I'm over here at the little trinket table, I want to point out a couple things. Tools of the trade, 6-inch ring infiltrometer. Like I went down to the mechanic shop and I had them cut me a bunch of these. I pound this in the ground 3 inches, and I have a measurement. I forget. It's about 500 mils of water, 400 and something mils for this. That's equal to an inch of rain. And I go to different places in a pasture or a crop field, and I measure water infiltration rate with this. This is probably the most important tool. This and a narrow spade that you can dig a soil pit with. Steve, you talked about how much you like digging soil pits. I've been to so many farms and ranches in the last while where the folks have never even dug a soil pit in their soil. But I can use this to do a soil health assessment and probably not have to do any soil test to tell you how healthy your soil is. The best folks are getting 1 inch of rain infiltrated in like 9 to 14 seconds, and the second inch within 45 seconds. So, Joe, you showed us the picture with your chicken legs of the 3.5 inches of rain. What do you think that 1 inch of rain infiltration rate was? Any guesses?
Oh, I know exactly what it was. It was about 2.5 minutes. My second inch was about 25 minutes, which for our area is phenomenal.
Yeah.
2 inches is about 24 hours. And 3 inches of rain in conventional soil, I just tell guys, if there's no aggregation there, it'll evaporate or run off before it ever infiltrates.
And when it does either one of those things, it's taking whatever nutrients that, like synthetics, you might have put on there with it, right? So soil compaction, which is another measurement of what your soil aggregation is. So I use a penetrometer for that. There's a digital penetrometer I've been looking at where I can map that out in your field, but I can actually tell how far down your hard pen is, and I can relate this also to infiltration rate. Measuring the bricks with the refractometer. So the time of the day that you graze your cattle or your sheep or your goats or your chickens or your pigs, you can actually get way more efficiency when you're grazing them at the right time of the day when the bricks level on your grass pasture is at the right level. But you got to know that, you got to measure, and it's super simple. You just take this out in the field and you use a garlic press and squish it and you can measure that. And then a grazing stick, so I can go over that later, but just some simple things that are actually highly scientifically valuable in terms of understanding where you're at on soil. Diversity. So this is a piola crop here. Who was it was talking about piola? Right, you had one of your...
My green guy's done it probably 6 or 7 times.
Right, and so he's combining and separating in the yard?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Very interesting thing about what he's found, he wants somebody to do a research study on it. 2 years after his piola, he's seen multiple times a boost in yield in that crop 2 years later. Not the year after, it's 2 years later. So he wants to know why. Any idea?
For 2 years after.
Second year after, he gets a boost in yield, and he's seen it multiple times now. So that piola, there's something to do with the biology that is kickstarting.
So what is it doing between the brassica and the legume? Like, it's doing something in the soil that takes that extra year for that to be biologically available. I don't know. I'm not that smart. But it's fascinating. So creating diversity. So I was thinking about this earlier today. So I had a family member, and I talked about Nortel, that big Canadian company. It was once the biggest company on the whole Toronto Stock Exchange. And I had a family member that had all their investment in Nortel. And they would let us know frequently, every time it went up, like 120, 125, they were literally a millionaire on paper. And then a few years later, I remember feeding cows in the tractor after I left, and it was worth this much, right? That's a monoculture. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago about a guy that worked at BlackRock, so I think it's one of the world's largest finance companies. He traded something like $13 trillion worth of value in his career. And what he said was fascinating about diversity, because he said, the smartest thing you can do with your money is buy we used to call them mutual funds, now they're an exchange trade fund, but you actually have a diverse portfolio. He said, park your money in an ETF and leave it for 25 years and never check it. And you'll get returns that you could never get if you're trying to play the market and just do like 1 or 2 or 3 different, leading stocks at a time. It was fascinating. And it just reminded me about how valuable it is to have diversity, because I'm repeating everything I heard from these two guys because I'm trying to make sure I learn from them, but you never know what the weather's going to do. I think you said that, Steve, right? So if you have different types of legumes and perennial grasses growing together, or even in an intercropping in a cash crop, because you don't know what the weather's going to do. And you also don't know what that's going to do in the soil, because even for people that are doing it, as was just witnessed, sometimes we don't know. But when you have diversity, you're actually de-risking what it is that you're growing. Keeping a living root in the soil. I have an individual I know, they're farming in east central Alberta. They took a silage crop off and they had fall rye and vetch as their cover crop. And they got pretty good establishment because they've been noticing that the wet weather is coming later in the year, which is why they decided to start cutting more silage, selling it to the feedlot down the road. They could get a cover crop going. 3 years ago, he went out in February and dug, because they had a good snowfall that year, dug down in the snow, and he had green plants growing underneath the snow. So they're actually still photosynthesizing because he had that living root in the ground even underneath the snow. Question?
You can prove that when it's green and lush like that, you can prove it is photosynthesizing?
If it's alive, like I don't.
Just because the sugar's in the plants keeping it green and lush like that. Because that's what I'm experiencing right now.
You're seeing that greenness?
Oh yeah, but that was my question. I thought it should be dormant at this point.
That's probably a good question in terms of plant physiology. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Is that plant actually alive and growing, or what's that? Because light gets through the snow. Yep.
Even if it's not actually photosynthesizing, if we've got that ground cover, the roots in there, and our frost hasn't gone deep, we have biology in the soil still actively doing something. They're feeding on roots, they're feeding on whatever. So even if the plant has stopped, having that biology still working underground is just beneficial, right? So I'd like to have biology working somewhere, somehow in my system, at least 250 days a year, right, in our environment. So yes, it's green, but they could still be decomposing it or working on it or feeding off the sugar still. So it's the biology I'm concerned about, not the plant.
And I think to carry on that is that spring, that next spring when that snow's gone, those plants have a head start on everything else that's there, right? So the biology that they're going to feed into the soil, their ability to photosynthesize, to capture, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in the 4 ecosystem processes, is going to be far advanced from anything else that is next door where there isn't any green. I was trying so hard to find this actual video, and the best I can do is give you this picture, but this is actually a plant that is pushing root exudates out into the soil. The video is phenomenal because all those little bits of sugar basically are being pushed out into the soil, and that's what's feeding the microbes in the soil. The microbes in your soil then, they get hungry and horny, and they multiply, and then eventually they die off in your soil, and then you get a microbial necromass, which is where the carbon is sequestered in your soil that becomes that soil aggregation that was talked about before. Animal impact. So we've seen and heard about lots of that today, but this is the sixth principle. If you think about 200 years ago, before a lot of our ancestors showed up, I've heard different numbers, anywhere from 40 million to 60 million ungulates running across North America. The current soils that a lot of our ancestors that came and started to plow and mine the value out of were created by buffalo, elk, deer, and all the other fauna and flora that goes with that, and created the soil that we have, along with a lot of prairie fire and forest fire, right, that all work together. We've eliminated all that, and we've taken the cattle that we have, and the cattle numbers, I think they're actually pretty close to the same in North America, but we put them in confined feeding operations, which then we have all the nutrients and all the biological impact in one place where we don't want it. Then we spend millions of dollars and millions of tons of CO2 to remove that and try and put it back on the land, and it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't follow what is a nature-based or a creation-based system. So having that animal impact, whether it's in a livestock operation or whether it's in a existing cropping operation, is really important, and we've heard about that already today as well. So just a couple different examples of how that biomimicry. I was really glad. I think Steve, you talked about the the biological shedding, right? And it's one thing I learned this summer when I went to the Soil Health Academy is I had never thought about things like hair coat falling off onto the ground. But there's a huge biological impact, whether it's cattle or sheep or pigs or chickens or whatever, that creates a biological atmosphere or enhances that for the biology to improve. That trampling effect along with the biological effect together is one of the biggest impacts of livestock integration. And so here's a very sort of straightforward example about how to mimic the way that those bison worked. So whether it's managed intensive grazing or you want to call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing, but the key is to be able to create that grazing intensity and impact. Rotational grazing, it's at least better than conventional or continuous grazing. And conventional or continuous grazing is sometimes it seems like the easy way. Like you turn your cows out on, May long weekend, and you pick them up at Halloween, and you put 40 or 50 pairs out in the neighbor's quarter, and you look at them once a week, and it looks like the grass is still holding, and that's a recipe for failure because you're not managing whoever. That's not a managed approach to it. But creating proper grazing intensity and then the rest and recovery periods, that's what's so important so that whatever crops are there, whatever grasses or legumes are there, they can actually be disrupted and purposefully impacted at the right time to cause more health in the plants and the soil. And so this is actual bison that this is a single strand. Like I've always heard the stories about, bison are so hard to manage and they got a half-a-mile flight zone, and we've all seen bison fences, those 8-foot-high page wire fences. This is bison with a single strand of polywire. I've seen pictures of one of the Turner ranches where they're moving like hundreds and hundreds of bison at a time, and everybody's just walking along. And that's because they've got good management. So we can create mimicry of nature, and we can do it with whatever type of species, chickens, pigs, bison, cattle, but it does take the right approach and it does take the right sort of mindset. But that's going to allow us to simulate nature. So these are wild herds, and that's what we're trying to recreate. A lot of this is probably going to be repetition. I'm going to skip that one and go to this one, because I've actually been in this field. So this is this is what they call the Black Belt in Alabama. So there's a belt of prairie soil down in Alabama, and this is the BDA farm. It's 2,500 acres. They had 660 Piney Woods cattle when I was there. I think they're at 1,400 now. They run a flock of sheep. They have a herd of pigs, and they run 3,000 chickens. And the chickens follow the cattle. I don't have a pointer, so in the background you can see there's some shading for them because it gets hot down there, and they have a water sprinkler system. And then in each one of those buildings, they're portable. They have a space underneath about 12 inches tall, and the chickens get in there. That's where they have layer boxes, and they lay their eggs in the boxes. They roll down, and they have some supplement in there as well. But they're eating grass and bugs. Like, there's no grasshopper problems there because the chickens clean them out. And when you're standing in the middle, like it's a little, it threw me off a bit, but they're just constantly pecking at your legs, like they're all around you. And they use guard dogs because the predators down there are hawks and foxes and the odd coyote. But the dogs, these Pyrenees dogs, have got trained when they see a shadow going over top, that they know that's a predator, they start to bark, and all the chickens run into those sheds because there's room enough for them in there, and they know that's their response. Now, they also have, maybe this is a good place to stop and talk about supply chain. Because you're like, oh, well, I've got 150 acres and I want to try and figure out how to, grow grass-finished beef and sell it. Or how do you sell, how many dozen eggs is that every day? It's like, 1,000 dozen eggs or something like that every day. But now they've got a supply chain that they figured out. They have a processing facility on the farm. But they've established a full supply chain where they can retain the value of their commodity all the way through to retail sale. They do the same with their beef. They process all their own beef. They package it and they distribute it from the farm. And they do the same with their pork and their lamb as well. And so there are opportunities coming up in Western Canada for things like whether it's animal protein. There's an individual I'm talking to that they're putting together a business in Saskatchewan for processing grain. And they're going to be looking for organic and certified, regenified grain products that they can put through the processing plant. And the demand pull that's coming from consumer packaged goods and retail for these kind of products, in the last 3 months, what I heard from my colleagues at Regenified Certified, which is another component of the group that I'm working with, where they certify your farm or ranch based on a protocol. The pull that's coming for the products from farms and ranches that is certified as regenerative agriculture is gone beyond what they ever thought it would be years down the road, because all of a sudden, consumers are driving that demand. Retailers are saying, well, we need that in our stores. Retailers are going to the processors, and processors are going in straight to the producers, and they're looking for orders like 80,000 bushels of certified organic regenified wheat, for example. So we've seen some good examples already today, and I'm sure we all have them, but I couldn't help but put this up. This is in central Saskatchewan on some rangeland. This is the exact same soil, obviously, from one side of the fence to the other. On the right side of the fence, it's actually at the same gate, but two different views. I think that might be overgrazed. That was someone who turned out a few hundred cow-calf pairs in the spring and went in the fall and picked them up. Never checked on them. Like, the soil biology has no chance there. I didn't have a thermometer with me, but it was a hot day. I don't know. The soil was probably at 120 Fahrenheit or maybe hotter. But on the left side of that fence, it's a completely different ecosystem, just because the barbed wire is there. And so that's the things that we can achieve when we set our minds towards making proper decisions and proper implementation of the 634. This is 600,000 live beef pounds per acre. So this is crimson clover, crusader ryegrass, graze of forage radish, hairy vetch, hunter leaf turnip, field peas, oats, and some volunteer canola. So this is 86 cow-calf pairs on 0.35 acres for 48 hours. So a few seconds before they got turned into here, and these are big cows, like these are 1,800-pound mother cows. So this is what it looks like. Just take a look at what the impact should be like from the trampling, so that livestock impact and the biological shedding. That's what it should look like. And that's what a crop cocktail can look like. Those are happy cows. Okay, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. I'm going to hustle along here. So it's the rule of compounding, the rule of disruption, and the rule of diversity. So in nature, things are always either on a positive cascading and compounding or negative cascading compounding. They're either always going up or they're always going down. There is no sort of neutral, there's no sustainable level to that. And so we have to apply adaptive stewardship practices to make sure that we're always achieving positive compounding effects going up. The rule of diversity is just that if we don't create diversity in terms of the different kinds of legumes and grasses or different crops that we're going together and different kind of livestock, because cattle and sheep and pigs and chickens, they all graze differently and they select for different plants and they leave different nutrients. So that's the idea of diversity. And I'm going to make us do something that is disruptive. So I'm going to ask you to stand up from where you're at and go find another place to sit down for the rest of the talk. It's not comfortable. It's not even comfortable for me to ask you that, but I want to demonstrate. This is the teacher coming out of me. I'm demonstrating what it means to create disruption. So just go find another spot and bear with me. You can say hi to someone at your table. You don't have to. This is the best example I could think of about how easy it is to get stuck in what we're always doing. I was pretty comfortable sitting here the whole time, and I'm like, oh man, I'm going to ask them to do something I'm not comfortable with. But unless we get out of our own way, and unless we create disruption, so that could be like, I'm busy in the spring. We're always seeding, and so I have a sort of sacrifice pasture, and then I put the cows there, and then they always go in the neighbor's pasture, and then I go get them, on July 1st, and I move them, and so we do the same every year. Well, what about even if we just change the order of that and let the grass have a longer rest and recovery period where they always go and start in the opposite direction? And when you get really good at this, then you start to actually create disruption on like a daily or even an hourly way with what you're doing with your livestock and when you start to think about your different cropping systems. So thanks for working with me on that. My wife's going to say, how did that go? Okay, the 4 ecosystem processes are the energy cycle, which is basically how much sunlight are we capturing. Every time we have a living plant with a leaf that's facing the sun, we're taking sunlight and turning it into liquid sugar in the ground as an exudate. Every bit of ground that we have that's not covered or with a dead plant, then it's photosynthetic leakage. We get one chance to capture those photons when they come down, right? And so that's why it's so important to have the right kind of energy flow. In terms of water cycle, it is about how well do we capture every drop of rain where it falls, and how fast can we infiltrate that into the soil? And so, water cycle works in both directions, right? It actually works, infiltration and evaporation. It also works across the soil horizon as well in terms of how do we move the water through the soil. The mineral cycle, sometimes called the nutrient cycle, it works when we have good biology. So the nutrients come from many sources, including the soil itself, the rocks, the rain, atmosphere, animal manure, urine, dead and decaying plant material, dead and decaying microbes in the soil for that matter. And there's 3 phases to the mineral cycle, which are moving minerals from below to above, and Steve talked about that some this morning, placing those minerals on the soil surface, and then moving the minerals from above the soil surface back into the soil, so moving it in all those directions. And then community dynamic is really about, it's like diversity, but it's an ecosystem process in that we have to have that biological diversity to create biological succession in the soil. And the greater the diversity we have, the healthier our ecosystem is, the more resilience that it has. We actually build resilience by doing that. I actually add in a 5th one to these 4 processes because carbon is definitely a part of the mineral cycle, but I think carbon, not because it's such a popular topic right now, but I've run my hypothesis by some leading soil scientists and soil experts across the globe. My hypothesis is that soil carbon is the apex measurement of functional soil health. So if your soil organic matter, your soil carbon is improving, then the way your whole system is working, plants and animals and soil, that's actually an indicator that everything is getting healthier and regenerating. If you're losing soil organic matter or soil carbon, and we can measure that, then you're actually losing function out of your system. So I think carbon is its own, or at least it's important enough to get its own mention. Water use efficiency. So I've heard Gabe say lots of things, and maybe some of you have. His book's over there, by the way. If you haven't read anything yet around regenerative agriculture, it'd be the book that I tell you, either read it or he actually narrates it on Audible, and he's got a very easy to listen to voice. It's one of the first books that I read, and I'm like, oh, okay, now I get it. Like someone that explained it, how they got to where they were, because his whole life was disrupted in 4 successive years. So it's a great book. But he talks about it's not how much rain you get, it's how much you keep. So I want to touch a little bit on drought, because last year in most of Alberta, except for east and north of Red Deer, and I think the Peace Country got some decent rain, right? So this is a map from Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada. So we're right now just sort of southeast Edmonton, right? But like look at east of Calgary and those areas where it's exceptional drought, and they're getting no snow. I just talked to someone down there. They had 3 inches of snow so far this winter. Some of the reservoirs down there are like, what did I read? Like 15% of current. They're currently at 15% of the capacity they should be at, and it's not snowing in the mountains. And so there's a modern dust bowl happening in some places. There's a couple pictures I want to show you. These are out of the U.S. Colorado in 2014 versus we've all heard about the dirty 30s and the dust bowl. This is happening. This is a couple years ago now, I guess this May. I think it was this dust storm that actually caused a number of people to get killed in a highway accident, because maybe that's the one that I'm referring to, but this is southern Alberta.
We're only 6 years away from the dirty 30s.
Like, and this Tory Campbell, I don't know him, but he was in the paper, so he's a farmer in the county. I've been down there and I've seen drifts in the ditch like that. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like,
We had a producer east of Lethbridge last year. His neighbor hadn't looked after soil. Dust, wind kicked up. He lost 38 end dumps worth of topsoil into the surrounding ditches that the local municipality had to come in and track go out, and they hauled it off the soil. And that land down there is vegetable irrigated land. Like, it goes for an abnormally high amount of money. And he lost 38 end dumps worth of topsoil.
how many hundreds of thousands of dollars is that worth? Right? So and I was cautioning myself to put these pictures up there because I don't want to be that person that's like the fear monger, right? But I'm like, this is real. And so how do we help each other get to the point where this never happens on our land, on our family's land, or the land that we want our kids or our grandkids to get? How do we actually make sure that never happens? And then I was down in Oklahoma at our annual meetings, and I saw this in my news feed. So we're talking about water sharing. And anybody here on irrigation? Couple? Have you heard anything yet about having to ration for this year?
Yeah, they were trying to shut us down last week too.
Yeah. So I don't want that to happen, but how do we get to the point where we're so resilient that if we have to reduce, that it's not going to impact us that much? And then it's just like every time I open up my news feed, I'm like, there's another. This is what's fascinating, is that it's not because we're looking into it that it's happening. It's because this is actually true, is that the way that you create your landscape can actually make it rain. So the Las Damas Ranch, so Alejandro Carrillo, he took over 25 years ago, the Las Damas. They get like 6 to 8 inches of rain, annual rainfall. They can measure 2 more inches of rain on their ranch than the very next door neighbor and the surrounding area. And so what they're finding out is that plants exude microbes and bacteria and fungi, and they make these, I wrote it down to make sure I got it right, atmospheric biological ice nucleators. But they're actually, what we're learning is that plants can create rain way more than dust particles where rain droplets form around. And I'm like, oh wow. So then I started asking questions like, okay, what scale does this happen at? And it looks like anything beyond about 20 to 25,000 acres of one contiguous landmass can create enough of an impact that it can cause rain. And this is a picture. So then when I saw this picture, I'm like, okay, did someone just get there at the right time? Or does the Las Damas Ranch actually make it rain? Because that's what that picture shows. They've been able to measure it. 2 inches on 8 inches is 25% more rain. And if you're in a desert, and if you're in the Chihuahua Desert, which is where they are, that means huge profit. So every 1 inch of soil organic matter gives you 25,000 more gallons of water per acre that you can hold when it does rain. And another inch of rain is another 4 bushels of canola. And so here's some good research showing, okay, if you're going to probably stay with a conventional system where you're continuing to mine out the soil organic matter, you are maybe using high tillage, high synthetics. This is the farm number one, it's organic, so they're going to use a lot of tillage, right, to address their weed issues. But if you look at farm 4, where they're using no-till, highly diverse in the crops they're growing, no synthetics, and they have livestock integration, they are getting 7% organic matter, and they can get 20 inches of water in the ground per hour. I would way rather be the farm on the bottom of that than the one on the top. And so how do we get there? So this next picture I thought was fascinating. So they dyed water and showed the water infiltration and how it follows the roots. So where did Steve go? I made him move. I want to know how you got Kernza, because that's not an easy thing to do. But how deep did you find the roots when you actually dug down?
It wasn't as impressive as I was hoping, but it could be because we're in very high clay.
Sure.
And it was a grain field that we couldn't penetrate. We did find some root hairs at about 5 to 6 feet, but not that massive root system that they talk about with Kernza.
And maybe that's more years of growing that crop and managing it well.
Now, what I'd like to see is that crop grow in my land, because my penetrometer can drop right to the hand, right? So that root system has a lot better chance without the compaction to be able to do what the picture shows.
When are you going to plant Kernza on your land? If you're curious, go on the internet and look up Kernza, and you'll see the pictures. And it's basically 6 or 8 feet of root mass. So if you can get 1 inch of water in the ground in 9 to 15 seconds, and you've got roots that go down a foot or 3 feet or 6 feet, like imagine the amount of water that you can then get down into the soil and the biology that's going to happen and the water that's moving across the biology and through those that soil aggregation as well as up and down. It's phenomenal. I don't know. I found this when I was looking up, examples of water infiltration, so I'd have to.
Great idea for a pasture walk like that. If you could actually do when people are standing there watching.
I was thinking how to replicate this, because that'd be fascinating. Yeah.
Come to greener pastures next year.
Okay. So a little bit about testing. There's lots of different ways to test soil. I showed you what I think is probably the most effective and the cheapest, but there is another way to look at soil biology. Regen Ag Labs out of Nebraska, they do the Haney soil test. So all the soil cores that I pull, I send them down to there, and they focus a lot more on biology and what the carbon is doing in the soil. So they look at the respiration of carbon out of the soil and organic carbon. They look at the ratios, the carbon to nitrogen ratio. There's a lot more what I find useful data from the Haney soil test than a conventional chemistry-based test. And it informs a lot more of what the baseline is of where you're at and then the things that you can change to go forward. And I'll show you how I kind of put that together in a system to give you a score back on that. Bless you. Okay, so that soil test is a part of this, what I call an infinitely regenerative analysis. So I think it was 4 years ago, and I was at Olds College and I was helping that smart farm to get going, but it was driving me a little bit crazy because everything that my time during the day was spent on was ag technology, which has its place, but I still couldn't get out of my mind the need to find a way to show a regenerative agriculture demonstration at enterprise scale, at farm scale. And so one day I was thinking, well, how would I go onto a farm or ranch, and how would I sort of create an understanding for the owner as to where they were at? And I wasn't sure that I had any idea how to do that. So I started building this scoring system, and I started with the 5 principles of soil health and have now built it up a bit. And so I showed you the 6-3-4, and I've taken that 6-3-4 and I've created a way to score each one of those quantifiable 5 principles. And the way I do that is I say, okay, in terms of don't disturb the soil, I've created a way to give you like a negative score to a positive score in each one of those. So I say, oh, is that farm or is that field, is that pasture using conventional tillage and all chemical throughout the field? Then you're going to get a -3 for that, do not disturb. But if you're using no-till and no chemical disturbance and you're doing the very best you can on that, you're going to get a +3. And I do the same for every one of those other of the total 5 principles. And then each one of those gets a score, and then that field itself gets a score on a continuum, anywhere from a -15 to a +15. So that field itself gets a score for the 6 principles. And then I do the same thing for the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and I scored on a continuum. But each one of those scores, I also relate it to a color. So if you get a minus score on that field, you're going to get a dark yellow or a brown because it's not very healthy and it's not regenerating. And if you get a high score, you're going to get a darker green or a dark green color. So you can either look at the score or you can look at each one of your fields for each of the 6-3-4, and you can say, oh, well, where am I at right now in terms of what does it look like? That field is a dark green. Well, it's probably in good shape, and I need to focus my efforts on something else. And so I do that, like I said, for the 6, the 3, and the 4. And then I score each one of your fields separately, so you can look at a field and get a comprehensive score for that field. And then I also summarize them all together, and I can give you a score for your whole ranch or your whole farm. And I did this because I'm like, okay, how can I help somebody understand where are they at, and what levers can they pull, and what buttons can they push, what cover crops could they use, what livestock integration could they implement, what could they change, and how could we measure that so that they could see a measured change in terms of either a quantified number or the color score. So this is the Floating Stone Ranch, and they ended up getting a -11 out of a total of 45 across their whole operation on their farm. Then I also mapped that all over on Google Earth Pro, so I can show you in a dynamic fashion each one of those fields, and you can look at it as a field, or I can zoom out and you can look at your whole farm. And then year over year, I can come back and score that every year, and you can start to see where the changes are, and then you get a quantified score of where you're at. It's almost like a yield map, but it's your whole system that's getting scored. One of the other things that I can work with you on is to create a plan in terms of livestock integration and also integrating cover crops. So I use that same effort that I go through to also map out your existing fences, proposed water systems, proposed cross fencing, and even proposed integration of cover crops or legumes. And all of that then leads into the Resilient Agricultural Landscape Program. And so I said I was going to talk a bit about that. The RELP program to me is like a complete no-brainer. So I know, Steve, you're working with ARDAR and OFCAF. There's all these terms. RELP is administered by Alberta Agriculture, and every single landowner is eligible for $150,000 cash. So you got to put the money up front. Like if it's, let's say you do a $100,000 project. Let's say you want to do offsite water systems. You want to put in some fencing to, build a perimeter fence, and then high tensile hot fence for your grazing system. And you want to integrate some legumes. Each one of those is the best management practice. So let's say you were to do all that and it was a $100,000 project. You'd have to be able to show that you've purchased all the equipment and you've borne all that cost, which also includes like the seed and the seeding cost for that. But you get if you get approved for $100,000 and your project was $100,000, you get $50,000 back right up front. And then you got to carry the other $50,000 till the end of the third year, and then you do a report, and then you get the other $50,000 back. But like Steve said, this is enabling folks that want to change their practices to more of a regenerative system. It gives them the infrastructure that you amortize that over the life of the equipment, not just the 3 years of the project. And I think it's like, why wouldn't you do that? So I actually use all that analysis I do and the maps that I build and everything to help you actually submit into the program, and I provide that as a service. So it's $150,000 for each landowner. If it's a grazing co-op or Métis or Indigenous, it's $300,000 that you're eligible for. The applications for 2024 opened up February the 2nd. Question?
Is it just Alberta? Is it another province?
Saskatchewan has one as well, but it's a little bit different. I haven't done one for there. I did a couple last year. It's not quite as good, but it's similar. And BC hasn't figured out what they're doing yet, the last I looked. But, yeah. Are you from BC? They had an advertisement like BC Ag or whatever, BC Minister of Agriculture said, stay tuned, it's coming. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, if you have an application in with OFCAF from last year and haven't heard anything back on it, or, well, they ran out of money,
Yeah.
can you now go into REL, or you need to pull that application, or is OFCAF done?
I can't answer that question. I don't know, Steve. The question is OFCAF done, or are they going to get refunded for this type of funding? Do you know?
OFCAF is renewed. It'll be opening shortly. RDAR is already open, but the other ones are still opening. They've got 1 year renewal for sure, and I did hear a while ago that they're renewing it till 2028, but I'm not guaranteeing that yet.
Yeah.
So the applications that are in with OFCAF from last year that were not taken, are they automatically in, or do you?
I'm not sure. You have to ask them.
I don't want to tell you what to do, but I've done a couple of these, and it's like, this is a great option to go down. Yeah. Yeah.
It says you're not supposed to be saying about pulling.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the right answer is go to OFCAF and ask them. But my other answer would be, well, then you want to probably get in line. Like, I don't know how subscribed last year the RELP one was. I don't think it was really highly subscribed. Not people knew about it. And it's way more complicated than what it needs to be. I did a couple of these, and it literally took me like 40 hours to put the one together.
You may not have the answer to this, but I know I've had a couple producers ask. So the OFCAF funding as a whole was administered by multiple different organizations. So Canadian Forage and Grazing, Canola
Yep.
Growers Association, RDAR.
That's right.
So I know we had some canola growers that had applied and then couldn't apply through RDAR because they'd already had funding. Is the RALP funding source the same as the OFCAF funding source?
It's from SCAP. It's from Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. But what they did is they gave money to RELP, and then they gave money to RDAR for OFCAF. But the RELP money is administered within Alberta Agriculture. They have their own approval and their own.
You have to pick one. Essentially, you couldn't apply for RALP and for RDAR stuff.
That's right, because there'd be like, for OFCAF, there was legumes you could get at and fencing. And I don't want to tell you which program to go with. All I can tell you is I've done a couple of these. Both of my clients got what they asked for. But what I do tell you, and this is the businessman coming out of me, is that I actually provide this as a service because it does take a lot of work. You have to do all the mapping. This program requires you to show all the mapping for all the work that you're going to do. And then the way the form is created, you have to break stuff down into best management practices, and then on a per field basis, and then you got to break it down on how your land is registered legally. So has anybody else done one? It's not super straightforward.
It's not, but once you finally sit down, I procrastinated for 6 months. Once I finally sat down and got to it, it's like you say, it's a couple days of work.
Did you get your money? Okay. So I can do that for you, but the way I work it is I charge 10% of the money that you get rewarded for the grant. But then you can claim back for each best management practice that you qualify for, you can claim back an accredited technical expert. And so I work with someone who is that, and then you can claim that back. So it's $2,000 per best management practice. So if it's a $100,000 grant, 10% is $10,000. You can claim $6,000 of that. Costs you $4,000, but I do all the work for you, and then I help you actually with implementing the plan. And how does that work within your regenerative system? So question was, is that similar to the environmental farm plan? No, but you have to have an environmental farm plan to qualify. Or you have to say, I'm going to do it within the next 3 years. Which means if you say you're going to do it and you don't, you're not going to get the other half of the money. So, and they've made the EFP a lot easier to do. Yeah. So the answer is there's a mentor that'll come out and help you. I did one on the ranch with my daughter years ago, and it took forever. It was like...
I think it might have taken us maybe 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah. And it's worth doing, and then it helps to make sure you qualified for these things. So anyways, that was a plug for how I can help you do that. The best management practices that I found that are the best fit for most folks are annual cropland conversion to native forages, the BMP 201 and 203 intercropping. So converting it to tame forages. And then there's also rotational grazing is one of them, which is just basically building a fencing system, and then off-site water systems. So all those qualify. That's just what the form looks like. And this is one of my clients that got approved for, they got approved for introducing legumes, rotational grazing, and off-site water systems. So they're just in the process of doing that. And then I went in, and then I can actually build the fence as well as another little side hustle that I do. So I built them a 2-strand hot fence, a little bit similar to the one that Steve talked about, but this is all with fiberglass posts and hot wire and a neutral wire. It was for riparian area exclusion, and you could make that you could make it 2 hots if you wanted to as well. But if you look at, like, that's the hottest fence that I think I'd ever worked with or built. It was 11,000 kilovolts, and it was actually coming through the controller. And that was in the winter. I just built it that day. So super effective, and it's the best way then to build the rest of your paddocks, because then you've got a perimeter fence of some kind where you can get all your power from. And then this is the Soil Health Academy. So Understanding Ag has the consulting services that we provide to you, and that I can come and work with you on. Just so you know that within that organization, I have the privilege and the blessing to have access to the partners at any time. So Gabe Brown phoned me yesterday morning, and we chatted for an hour because I had some questions for him earlier on in the week. And if there's something that's complex or in an area that I'm not familiar with, I can access any of the partners or any of the other consultants. So we also have specialists in dairy, in poultry, in specialty crops or high-value crops like orchards and vegetables, and then in different parts of the globe. So we meet every Monday morning, and we usually do a case study. So if anybody has any questions or they want to run something by the rest of the team. So that's the value of that. And then the Soil Health Academy is a separate non-for-profit organization, and they offer all kinds of different training throughout North America and globally, for that matter. I went to the Soil Health Academy 3-day course in Michigan in July, and I'm hoping I'm the first one to say I don't know everything I need to know, but I usually think I know enough. And I went to the Soil Health Academy, and I learned a ton going there as both a presenter and a participant. So the next one coming up in Canada is in McCord, Saskatchewan, the 25th to the 27th. They're $1,395, I think. I have to check on that. I think that's what the tuition is. And And the level of instruction you get is phenomenal, but every single day there's hands-on. So you actually get out onto the farm, the demonstration farm, and you'll do all kinds of stuff with soil, with the plants, and with livestock. And you actually will build paddocks, and you'll move livestock, and you will do things like figuring out what 100,000 pounds of livestock impact is, and then we'll do 1,000,000 pounds, and we'll actually measure that and observe what the differences are. So, a plug for that. And I think it was Steve, did you make a comment about carbon? Oh yeah, your carbon capture machine. This is a carbon capture storage plant. On the bottom is a psychopathic delusion. I don't understand how we're ever going to get anywhere with mechanical direct carbon capture, putting it in deep geologic formation. I think it was John Kemp. I heard him say one time that John Kemp, Advancing Eco-Ag, we have 415 parts per billion of CO2 in the atmosphere right now. And he said this, and it took me a minute, and I had to go, I backed it up and backed it up and backed it up. And I think he's probably right. He said there's not enough atmospheric carbon right now for true regenerative agriculture to work the way that it should at scale. And I was like, wow, that's a giant idea. But we need to put atmospheric carbon into the soil as soil organic matter, and we need to improve the efficiency of the carbon system. This is not about taking CO2 and storing it even in the soil for long term. It's actually about using plants and animals to make a more efficient system and to cycle that faster. And that's how we're going to be more profitable. That's how we're going to be enhancing the nutrient density of food, and it's how we're going to increase our functional soil health.